All right, everybody, buckle up because we're about to take a deep dive into a historical event that practically defines the phrase butterfly effect, the Fall of Saigon. We're not just talking about one city changing hands here, but the ripple effects of choices, big and small, that resonated across the globe.
And you're spot on with that butterfly effect analogy. You can't truly grasp the fall of Saigon just by looking at a timeline of events. It's about recognizing this complex web of decisions and their unintended consequences stretching back decades.
It's about understanding the why behind the what.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how seemingly insignificant moments can dramatically alter the course of history.
So let's set the stage, shall we? Imagine Vietnam before World War II. Picture a nation already chafing under French colonial rule, yearning for independence. This wasn't some abstract concept. It was a deeply ingrained desire that fueled everything that came after.
You hit the nail on the head. That yearning for self-determination turned Vietnam into a powder keg, just waiting for a spark. And, well, the Cold War provided that spark, turning a regional struggle into a global confrontation.
Right. The Cold War completely changed the game.
Absolutely. And that's when you see the eruption of the First Indochina War. Groups like the Viet Minh emerge, fiercely battling for their independence from France. This ultimately leads to the Geneva Accords, which, ironically, while intended to establish peace, ended up dividing Vietnam in two.
Which, as we know, is rarely a recipe for lasting peace.
Exactly. That single decision to divide Vietnam would have far-reaching consequences, shaping the destiny of the nation and drawing in global powers, including the United States. And this, I think, is where things get really interesting.
Because that's when the U.S. really gets sucked into the conflict, right? Cue the domino theory, the idea that if one Southeast Asian nation fell to communism, the rest would follow like dominoes toppling over.
Precisely. And despite what we now understand about the complexities of the region, that theory, as simplistic as it may seem, completely reshaped U.S. foreign policy. It's fascinating to trace its influence from the Truman administration through Eisenhower and Kennedy. And then, of course, comes Lyndon B. Johnson. Under his watch, well, U.S. involvement in Vietnam escalates dramatically.
It's like they kept raising the stakes, thinking they could control the outcome, but
Each administration, each decision, ultimately had its own set of unintended consequences.
And as we dig deeper into this, you start to see just how massive the U.S. commitment to Vietnam became. Hundreds of thousands of troops, billions and billions of dollars poured into this conflict. At what point does it stop being about, like you said, containing communism and become something else?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to understand the answer, we have to shift our perspective a bit. You see, while the U.S. was fixated on this idea of a monolithic communist bloc, they often missed, or maybe just underestimated, the nuances within Vietnam itself.
It's like they were so busy playing chess, they forgot there was another player sitting across the board.
That's a great way to put it. And the player they were up against was Ho Chi Minh, a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, and someone completely dedicated to unifying Vietnam under his vision.
Okay, so not just some communist figurehead.
Not even close. His brand of communism was uniquely Vietnamese, intertwined with national identity and the pursuit of independence. He resonated with the Vietnamese people in a way that Western powers often struggled to grasp.
You're saying the U.S. completely misread the situation, underestimated Ho Chi Minh's influence, the Vietnamese people's will to fight.
Absolutely. And perhaps no event exposed that miscalculation more starkly than the Tet Offensive in 1968. Now, militarily speaking, the Tet Offensive was a defeat for the North Vietnamese. But strategically, it was a victory of extraordinary proportions.
Hold on, how can an event be a loss and a win at the same time? How does it even work?
Think about it. The American public, they thought the war was winding down, that the Viet Cong was on its last legs, and then, bam, the Tet Offensive hits. Suddenly, there are attacks all across South Vietnam, even on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon.
Which must have been terrifying.
Absolutely. And it completely shattered this narrative of American control, of inevitable victory. The impact on public opinion back home, profound.
This is when the anti-war movement really starts to gain steam, right?
Exactly. The Tet Offensive was a turning point. The war, which had once enjoyed relatively broad support, was now deeply unpopular, politically untenable. It put immense pressure on President Johnson, who ultimately decides not to seek re-election. And into this maelstrom steps Richard Nixon, inheriting a deeply divided nation and an increasingly messy war. His solution, Vietnamization.
Which, if I'm remembering correctly, basically meant gradually withdrawing U.S. troops, equipping and training the South Vietnamese army to fight their own battles.
You've got it. And on paper, it probably sounded like a reasonable plan. The problem was, it rested on some pretty shaky assumptions. Nixon was banking on the South Vietnamese army being capable enough, motivated enough, to hold their own against the North. And perhaps more crucially, he underestimated the sheer tenacity, the unwavering resolve of the North Vietnamese.
It seems like every time they tried to simplify things to control the narrative, reality had other plans.
And that's the thing about unintended consequences. They rarely follow a neat and tidy script. You might think that pulling back, that decreasing involvement, would lead to de-escalation. But in this case, it created a vacuum that the North was more than ready to fill.
A good reminder that history rarely unfolds the way we expect it to, huh?
It certainly is. And it highlights how important it is to go beyond the surface, to understand not just what happened, but the why behind it, the motivations, the miscalculations, the forces that shape these pivotal moments.
And speaking of pivotal moments, this brings us to the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. After years of fighting, a peace agreement is signed, U.S. troops begin to withdraw, and I imagine there was this collective sigh of relief, a sense that the nightmare was finally over. I imagine most folks back in the U.S. were thinking, okay, good, glad that's over, time to move on. But it wasn't quite that simple, was it?
You're absolutely right. It's human nature to crave closure, to want to believe that once agreements are signed and troops withdraw, that's it. Peace is here to stay.
Right.
But history has a way of throwing curveballs.
And in this case, the next chapter was a tragic one.
It was a tragedy on many levels. In 1975, just 2 years after those hopeful scenes in Paris, North Vietnam launches a massive offensive, a final push to reunite the country by force.
And the South Vietnamese army, the one the U.S. had spent years and billions of dollars equipping and training,
they just couldn't withstand the onslaught. And I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about understanding the internal dynamics within Vietnam.
Right, how the U.S. might have missed some crucial details while focusing on this larger Cold War chess game.
Exactly. While the North Vietnamese were united, absolutely driven by this shared goal of unification, the South Vietnamese government they were grappling with internal divisions, corruption, a lack of popular support. They never quite managed to inspire the same level of fervent, almost unwavering commitment that Ho Chi Minh had cultivated in the North.
So it wasn't just about tanks and planes and troops. It was about the will of the people, the strength of their convictions.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that lack of a unified front, that inability to forge a cohesive national identity, played a significant role in the South's ultimate collapse. And then come the images that are seared into our collective memory. The Fall of Saigon. Those chaotic scenes of helicopters evacuating people from rooftops, desperate attempts to escape by sea, a nation in chaos.
Heartbreaking images that really capture the human cost of this conflict.
A stark reminder that wars are rarely won or lost on battlefields alone. But the impact of the Fall of Saigon, it went far beyond Vietnam's borders. It sent ripples of shock and uncertainty throughout Southeast Asia, emboldened communist movements, and even played a role in the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia.
The Khmer Rouge, another tragic chapter. That regime was responsible for one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century.
A stark reminder that the consequences of events like the Fall of Saigon can be far-reaching and utterly devastating. And it wasn't just Southeast Asia that felt the impact. Back in the United States, the war in Vietnam, culminating in the Fall of Saigon, left deep scars on the national psyche. We're talking about the Vietnam Syndrome, this wave of disillusionment, a reluctance to engage in foreign interventions after the devastating experience in Vietnam. It cast a long shadow, one that continued to shape U.S. foreign policy for decades.
It's incredible when you really think about it, how those early decisions, buying into the domino theory, escalating U.S. involvement, ended up shaping global events for years to come. And it all circles back to that idea we started with, the butterfly effect, how even the smallest choices can have these massive, often unpredictable consequences.
And that's what makes history so fascinating, yet so humbling, isn't it? It's not just a linear progression of dates and events. It's this intricate tapestry woven from choices, chance encounters, and unintended consequences. As we've seen with the Fall of Saigon, the past is rarely neat and tidy, but it's full of lessons that can inform the present if we're willing to listen.
Absolutely. Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a journey. And to our listeners, thanks for coming along for the ride. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning from the past.